Have you ever heard someone claim that modern Bible translations are corrupt, that they've actually removed words from Scripture? Well, today we're going to get right into a fascinating case study that tackles that exact accusation. It's a bit of a detective story, really, involving one missing phrase, a serious charge, and a trip way back in time to the earliest Christian manuscripts. Let's get into it. All right, we're not going to waste any time. We're diving straight into the deep end with a really serious claim you've probably seen floating around the internet: the idea that modern Bibles have been deliberately tampered with. And there it is. That's the accusation in black and white. The claim is that translators, for some reason, maliciously removed the phrase "of the Gentiles" from a verse in 2 Timothy. Now that is a huge charge, and if you don't know the backstory, it can sound pretty scary. So, what's the real story here? Is this some kind of modern conspiracy to change the Bible? Or is there another explanation for why this phrase isn't in most of our Bibles today? That's what we're here to figure out. First things first, let's just look at the evidence for ourselves. This slide puts it all out there. On the left, you've got the classic King James Version, and it clearly says Paul was a teacher of the Gentiles. But on the right, you look at modern translations like the ESV or the NIV, and that phrase is gone. You can see why people are asking questions. To solve a mystery like this, you can't just compare one English Bible to another. You've got to go back to the source. You have to consult the originals, the oldest Greek manuscripts we have. It's time to call our ancient witnesses to the stand. And here is. This is probably the single most important fact in this entire investigation. That little phrase, "of the Gentiles," it just isn't there in our oldest and most trusted copies of 2 Timothy. Now, these names might sound a little intimidating, but think of them as the heavyweights of manuscript evidence. A codex is basically a really old book, written by hand centuries before the printing press. And these three, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, are some of the absolute best, most ancient copies of the New Testament that exist, some going back to the 300s AD. And you know what? They all agree. The original verse ends with, "and a teacher," period. So you see, this changes everything. Modern translators didn't remove a thing. What they actually did was make a correction to get back to what the verse originally said, based on our best and oldest evidence. It's not an act of corruption, it's an act of faithfulness. Okay, that leads to a pretty obvious question, right? If the phrase wasn't there to begin with, how in the world did it get into the King James Version? Well, to answer that, we need a super quick history lesson. This timeline really puts it into perspective. See that massive gap? The King James Version was translated from a Greek text called the Textus Receptus, which was put together in the 1500s. And that text was based on manuscripts that were much later than the ancient ones we have now. Sometime in that 1200-year gap, a scribe somewhere added the extra words. So how does that happen? Well, the most likely answer is something called scribal harmonization. And it's not as sinister as it sounds. Back when scribes copied every single letter by hand, they'd sometimes, often without even thinking about it, add a word or a phrase to make one verse sound more like a similar verse they remembered from somewhere else in the Bible. And in our case, you can totally see why a scribe would do this. He's copying 2 Timothy 1:11, and his brain just goes, "Oh yeah, Paul is the teacher of the Gentiles." He remembers it from 1 Timothy chapter 2, where Paul does say that. So he adds the phrase to make the two verses match up nicely. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was just a scribe trying to be consistent. Okay, so we've pretty much figured out the how and the why. But that brings us to the biggest question of all. Does any of this actually matter? By correcting this verse back to the original reading, are we damaging some core Christian belief? Let's just ask it plainly. If we don't have the phrase "of the Gentiles" in this one verse, what crucial piece of theology do we lose about Paul's mission? The answer is zero. Absolutely nothing. Not a single bit of Christian doctrine is changed or lost. And the reason is simple. Paul's job as the apostle to the Gentiles is one of the most rock-solid facts in the entire New Testament. It is everywhere. Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Acts. The Bible is crystal clear on this point. Taking a later scribal addition out of one single verse doesn't change that reality one bit. So, it's time to review the evidence and close the case on the missing phrase. Let's deliver the verdict. When you really look at it, the whole corruption argument just falls apart. Think about it. Why would a corrupt translator remove the phrase from only one verse, but leave it in all the others? It makes no sense. The simplest explanation, the one that fits all the facts,
is that it was a later addition by a well-meaning scribe, not a modern removal by a malicious translator.
This chart really sums it all up perfectly. On one side, you have the accusation, modern corruption, a malicious removal, and lost doctrine. But on the other side, you have the evidence, an ancient scribal habit, a faithful correction, and zero doctrinal change. The evidence is just so much stronger.
And that's really the bottom line here. What looks like a conspiracy on the surface is actually just a misunderstanding of how we got our Bible, how texts were copied, and how modern scholars work tirelessly to get us as close as humanly possible to the original words.
So we'll leave you with this to think about. Understanding that scribes were far more likely to add something for clarity than to remove something is a really powerful tool. It doesn't weaken our trust in the text. If anything, it strengthens it because it shows the incredible, painstaking care that goes into making sure the Bible you read today is as accurate as it possibly be.